Welcome to another season of Quilting with Char. My daughter Angie and I have spent a lot of time getting ready for this series, and we cannot believe how fast time has gone by, can we?
I think it always goes by really fast and you love what you do and have a lot of fun doing it.
And the other thing that we talk about is we wonder what we're going to do new in another season. And it seems like every time we go to a quilt market or a quilt show, we run into something else that just gets us all excited and we're ready to go back home and get started with new things.
There's always something new and always somebody with a new idea.
Absolutely. And so that's what we're going to do in this series, is show you all the latest things that we've seen in the last year. We're going to start out this series with a wonderful quilt. It's very similar to the Irish chain, and we're calling it chain letter. And the reason that it's called chain letter is that the outside border of this fabric is made with vintage postcards from my new fabric line, Age of Innocence. And then, of course, from there, the rest of the line fell into place.
Right.
Actually, Angie and I designed this quilt together, and you'll see that it is related to the Irish chain and that it has a path going diagonally in both directions. However, we alternated the colors, so we didn't continue the burgundy or the green going in that diagonal way. We just did a rickrack pattern.
Do you remember when we first had it up there, we had all really light colors and it just wasn't doing anything at all? So then we put the little bit darker shade of the maroons and greens up there, and then all of a sudden it gave it just that little bit of twinkle that it has now.
And you know, you noticed it, Angie, before I did, and it was because we had it on a far away wall and we were able to see that the colors just didn't pop. Something else that is different in this one, in the center of each of the chains, you'll see that there's a square on point, and that's created by half square triangles set in the corner of each block.
It just gives it a little more interest instead of having the solid white middle. And it gives you some fun opportunities to do some fun quilting. If you notice, it's a square, but we didn't stay within the lines of the quilt pattern. We went outside of it and it made kind of a little flower around the middle. So.
And then in the diagonal paths, we stayed on the red with a burgundy thread, and then on the green with a darker shade of green. We always try to go a little bit darker than the value of the fabric. And because the pattern wouldn't really show on the outside border, we just did a free overall meandering. You know, this all started with
the table runner of the month that we do in our shop back in Minnesota. We have a group of ladies that come once a month, and we come up with a new pattern for them. And so it was in the month of our St. Patrick's, and you came up with the St. Patrick's or the Irish chain, and it's the same exact pattern, but it looks totally different because of the colors. And then we appliqued shamrocks on each end, and there's little Celtic quilting designs in the blank square backgrounds, and everybody had a lot of fun that day putting that together.
You know, anytime you come up with a pattern like this, you can make it into just a pillow top, a table runner, wall quilt like we did behind us, or just continue on and make a queen size quilt. And because I haven't had the fabric very long, I wasn't able to get the queen size quilt, but it is cut and ready to sew. The shapes that are in this quilt are very simple ones. Actually, there's only 2 shapes used in the whole quilt. There's just a simple half square triangle, and these are shapes from the Quilter starter kit, and then of course the little small square. That's the only 2 shapes that make up the whole quilt. I'm going to show you how I cut the half square triangles. And you know, sometimes when people fold their fabric and get ready to cut, you wonder, how are you going to deal with all this bulk of fabric that seems to hang over the edge? Well, a tip that a good quilting friend shared with me was that you just bifold the fabric up on top of the mat board so it all can travel at the same time and it doesn't hang over the edge of the cutting table. Then the next thing that you're going to do is to straighten that edge of the fabric, and you just line up the edge of the ruler with the folded edge and then cut with a rotary cutter.
I love that piece of fabric. I love the little notes behind the roses.
Yeah, these were all created, these patterns are all created with vintage postcards. And you know, Ange, I forgot to mention that we like to pre-wash all of our fabric,
Very
dry it in
important.
the dryer, and then spray it with a spray starch before you start to cut your fabric. That way it's a lot easier to work with.
So you've got the template all measured up and just cutting the strip.
And then we'll remove this, and then Angie, if you'll hand me the small mat board.
Okay.
And again, we'll bifold it up on top of there, and we need to remove that selvage edge, and we want to have the bias in the center part of our half square triangle or in the center part of our square. Just cut off the selvage, and then you would just repeat and cut again, and you would have absolutely no waste when you get to the end of that strip. And really, you know, Angie, I don't think we need to show them any more of the cutting because it is just squares left to cut.
Just one more thing that if you notice on the bottom they have the little grips, and that really helps even for your rulers to put the little grips on, keeps it from slipping.
Mm-hmm. I think we're ready to go now and sew at the sewing machine. We have some pieces cut over here, and we have the machine set at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that makes up for the fabric used in the seam line. And I like to always start sewing with an anchor cloth, so I'll take one of these little pieces and fold it in half.
That's really helpful. That's one of the best tips I think you ever gave me, was the anchor cloth. It really keeps the fabric pieces from going down into the feed dogs.
And you know what? I have to remember to bring up my feed teeth because we were free motion quilting before. And you know, half square triangles, Angie, are probably some of the easiest shapes, or this whole quilt really is a beginner quilt because all the shapes are identical, so you just match them up right sides together.
That's the first thing we started Brittany on, was half square. And then we just squared them up with another square, so it's kind of nice for beginners. If they go over a little bit, they can just square up the outside edges.
And then guide your fabric with a stiletto in front of the presser foot. We'll just scoot this over a little bit and hold on to it. Normally you would chain sew, you know, a whole bunch of these, but because of time I'm just going to do one.
Why don't I press that for you? You can finger press it first and I'll press it on the iron.
You finger press it on a hard surface. If you do it on the ironing board, of course your pointer finger will sink down into the ironing board, and then you'll end up with those little valleys. But before you do that, I'm going to show them that to make sure that you have the right seam allowance, what you can do is lay your template up on top of the 2 half squares sewn, and if it doesn't match, just trim off a little bit, or if it's too small, of course you have to adjust. Okay, if you want to press that. Now I'm going to take you into another part of the quilt. I'm going to start here by putting this 4-patch together, and ahead of time I had already sewn or chain sewn a bunch of these together, and again I'm going to show you how we pass the sewing test with that. You lay the rectangle from the Quilter starter kit on top of those 2 pieces, and when it equals that, you know you got your seam allowance correct. This definitely is a beginner quilt. Now when pinning this intersection, there's actually a couple of different ways that I can show you, and I'm going to show you on this one. The first method I show you is going to be where you stab the pin right on the seam line, 1/4 of an inch from the edge through the top and the bottom. And then the next pin that I put in, I'm going to put on in front of the stab pin or the standing pin. And that's one of the ways that I do a lot of my piecing. I don't know, Angie, which is your favorite way? Is this the one you like?
I use that a lot, or sometimes I just do the pin in the middle. It depends on the seam, but that's the one that Brittany prefers, I know.
Then you slow down over that intersection and then sew off the end. Now the next one that I'm going to show is a little bit different. What I'm going to do is flip this seam allowance to the left and this one to the right, even though those seams have been pressed open. And I kind of like this method, so I've flipped them in opposite directions, and then I'll flip them back both in the same direction and carefully holding on to them. Then I will put a pin right on the seam line through the top and through the bottom, and then I'll look in the bottom and see, yep, it's right on, and then flip that seam allowance back over, and so now the pin is hidden underneath the fabric on both the top and the bottom.
I don't think I've ever seen you do it that way, but I like that way.
I like this one a lot.
You're always showing me something new.
And then we'll straighten out this edge of this fabric. And you just leave that pin inside until you get to the end of the seam. And something that Angie and I do is never backstitch at the beginning or the end of the seam. And now we'll take a look at both of these seam allowances and see how they look after they're done. And I think they'll both be just fine. I just gotta make sure, and we'll talk about, yep, that one's just perfect. And of course then you would finger press that seam allowance open. You can press that one. And the next one, again, is just perfect. So either method works out really well. And
There again, you can check it with the square and make sure that it's
yep,
the right
that's a
size.
good idea, is to check. And if you're a beginner, maybe that's something that you want to do each time, is after you have sewn a unit together, check it with a template and make sure that it works out okay. Now the next thing that I'm going to show you how to do is to sew the half square units together in the center of the block. And to do that, what you're going to do is flip them over right sides together. And when you have a diagonal seam like this in a corner, what I like to do is pin it a little different than I normally do. But the first one will go in, of course, right on the seam line, 1/4 of an inch from the edge, matching up the points. But the part that's different is that the second pin that I put in goes in at an angle instead of straight across. And then we'll start out by sewing on an anchor cloth.
I think that's one of the hardest seams to actually make come out.
And then we will carefully sew onto here. You know, it is a good idea to slow down when you sew over the pins. You know, you don't want to sew over them really fast. Okay, so that goes pretty fast. And again, that one turned out really good. I'll clip this off and finger press that seam open. I press most of my seams open. There are times when I don't, but every quilt is a little bit different. And now when you look at that, you'll see that this intersection is 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the block.
It looks really good.
So you can pin that together. Now I'm going to take you up to the top of the flannel board, and if you look up here, you'll see that we have 2 completed blocks ready to be pieced together. And so what I'm going to do now is flip those over and sew those together. Now when we do this, I'm going to show you something through here. When you pin these seams together, you'll notice that the intersection from the edge of the seam is 1/4 of an inch from the edge. So that's where I want to insert the pin each time. So first through the top, and then through the bottom. Leave that pin standing. And then we'll put another pin in front of it. And then we'll go on again to the next seam and do the same thing. Put a pin right on the seam line, 1/4 of an inch from the top, through the middle, and then leave that pin standing and put another one in here. And you would just continue pinning all the way through and then sew directly over that intersection 1/4 of an inch from the edge, and that's how you get those perfect points on the right side. I'm not going to take time to sew that seam because I want to talk about the table runner down in front of us, and Angie and I laid out this block a little bit differently than we did the one in the quilt. When you take a look at it, you'll see that there is a green block in the center, and on each end you see a pink block. That's another way to lay out this particular quilt. So you have more than one way you can do this, obviously. Now I have a sandwich prepared and it's ready to be quilted. The bottom layer is, of course, your back, and that's laying with the right side facing down. You have a batting in the center, and then I have pinned the top on. And I'm going to now change to a walking foot, and we're going to quilt it diagonally with a walking foot. We like to use this one a lot, don't we, Ange?
It's really my favorite part of the quilt is when you get to the quilting, and that wasn't the way it always was. I like to just do the tops, and then when it came to the quilting, I usually try to talk you into it or somebody else, but the walking foot and the stippling foot, they make it fun to do some of your small projects on your own.
There are so many quilting aids now that we have, and the reason that we like to use the walking foot is that it feeds the feeds the fabric evenly from both the top and the bottom of the sewing machine. The feed dogs will feed equally as fast as the top. Also, something else that we're going to do, Angie, is we're going to switch to a 12 weight thread, and we like to do that because it shows up a little bit more on the top stitching.
It just adds a nice decorative top and doesn't sink down into the fabric so much.
And then the other thing that we're going to do is lengthen out our stitch a couple of points. I think we're going to go to a 3.0 stitch length.
And then put your needle in the center position too.
Yes.
So you can go right down the middle.
Yes, I do have to remember. Thanks for reminding me to put it in the center needle position. And we'll lengthen it out, and we're ready to quilt. That's how easy it is to set up for the machine quilting. Now I have the green thread in, so we're going to go, we'll start right here in the center. You like to start in the center of the quilt, and I already had tacked, you know, the 3 layers down with a pin, and I'm just going from point to point using the walking foot. So I have a shade of green that's a little bit darker than the fabric, and now when I get down to this corner, I will stop and pivot right at the corner.
It's really nice how the needle stops down in, so you don't lose your spot when you stop.
And this stabilizes the quilt too, and then we can go to some free motion quilting if we want to, but you want to do all the straight lines first. And on this one I thought, well, I would do the green thread on the green square and then switch to the burgundy on the burgundy squares.
It's really a fun project.
Now in the center we can do the same as what we did on the quilt, or we can go with some other pattern. There's so many different ways that you can go with this. And I also use the walking foot for putting the binding on as well.
It's one of the most, I think it's one of the most valuable pieces in our little quilting accessory kit. I really love that foot.
Well, we're just running down the home stretch on the center block. You know, Angie, I'm sorry that we've run out of time and we're not going to be able to show some free motion quilting, but we'll catch that in one of our other programs. Thank you so much for sharing this time with us today, and don't go away because Linda Taylor has more machine quilting tips to share with us. Today Linda's going to show us some different ways to quilt the Irish chain.
Well, Irish chains are very common, and they can be, you know, you get tired of seeing the same thing. So let me show you some cute things that we can do in this. One of the most common things to do is to actually cross-hatch. I like to do at least 3 lines of cross-hatching. You can see how easy it is to do with our rulers. We just slide this right down to here. And then back. And we do that again in the middle of our blocks, all the way to the end.
Oh, that'll look nice.
That'd be neat. It really frames it. And back. And we could go again and do the outer one, and we could come back in there. But I also want to show you a cute design that we're going to do in the middle. Now this rose fabric is pretty inspiring, I must say. And so I'm going to do a feathered rose in this block.
And that green thread is
With
really
this
going to
green thread.
show up.
Oh, it
Very
will.
nice.
I'm going to first do a hook. Just kind of come in here with a hook like that. That'll give me a chance to cut the thread. And then we're going to do like a little loop. And we'll start with these feathers. You want to lay them down. They'll come out like this, and they gradually get larger. So we have the inside of our feather in there, and then we have our petals as we come around. We'll reach out to the edge of the square.
Oh, so you're just continuing around. Oh, that's
Still
nice.
tucking them under.
Oh, that's nice.
And we can just kind of end right there. So we filled in that whole space with a nice little feather. Out on the corners, it will be real easy to also put a little feather out here. And you can do that in 3s. If you do one that comes out like this, then follow the side out all the way over and then back like that. You really can't go wrong with those.
You're just not afraid to try new things. That's what I think is so. I would never be that brave to just, go around like
Keep going around.
that. So how do you get good at this? You start practicing on paper? Is that what you do?
Drawing is going to really help your technique, but mainly you just dig in and start thinking, and the quilt speaks to you, and you just do more and more things on them. Now we can move over to the next one. I'll show you another technique that we'll do around the little squares that form the chain. And this is our continuous curve. Go around like that, and then as you come back, you'll go on the inside of that like this.
Oh, sure.
Oh, this is so fun. You don't want to quite use the foot width because you don't want to do quite 1/4 of an inch. You tend to swing too far out when you do that. And then we'll come back. You'll at least be able to see quite a portion of how this is going to look.
Oh, that looks nice.
Isn't that neat? It
Yes.
forms circles around it as well as form a design in there.
And you need to do something in each one of those patches.
Yes, you really do. You do. Now in the center of this one, we could actually come over, and we're going to put a little pinwheel in each of the triangular areas. Come out like that. Come over here, go in, come back out.
Again, that green thread is just looking awesome in there. Oh, that's beautiful. And just end
Isn't that
up in
pretty?
the corner. Yes, that is very nice.
You could also come back and finish with your ecru thread through this area instead of the green.
Thanks, Linda, for sharing those tips with us.
You're welcome.